There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and to another episode of Zooming In, an occasional series where I talk with bookish social media luminaries the world over about articles about bookish literary topics. And I'm delighted to welcome back Trevor of the famous The Mookse and the Gripes website and podcast. Trevor, welcome back.
Thanks so much, Shawn. I've been loving this series you're doing, and I'm just giddy to be able to participate as I have. So thank you so much.
Well, if I ever needed a blurb, there's a blurb. I made Trevor Barrett giddy. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. We're going to talk about an article that is it's about a really interesting topic for readers. The title is "Why Are So Many Authors Abandoning Speech Marks?" And the author is way at the bottom, Mia Kapler, and it was in the October 3rd edition of The Walrus magazine, which is a Canadian artsy-fartsy magazine. So, dying to hear your thoughts and pick your brains on this, Trevor. What did you make of this article?
So I didn't realize this was a trend that was kind of happening. I should have, but maybe it's been so kind of slow in coming in a way that many books have it where they've abandoned quotation marks, and many still have it that I'd never really stopped to think about it recently. I do remember when I first came across books that didn't have quotation marks, and that was probably in college when I was reading James Joyce, for example, and in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, not getting quotation marks, but he would still sometimes signify a dialogue with a dash at the beginning. But a lot of these authors in this piece have just, they're gone, and there's not a dash. Some of them, they might use italics, but many of them just write to blur that line between thought and what the character is saying, in this article pointed out in very interesting ways.
So I guess if you haven't really noticed it, hasn't been a big problem for you.
I guess in a way, maybe we've been primed for this, is maybe what I'm saying, because Cormac McCarthy doesn't use them. And I remember his thoughts. The article does point out that he, in an interview, said if you write well enough, you don't need punctuation marks at all, let alone quotation marks. And I remember reading that when he said that, and thinking about that. So I guess maybe I'd made my peace with it, a couple decades ago or so, and hadn't noticed that more and more of our contemporary authors are getting rid of them. But then again, yeah, a lot of the books that were brought up are a couple of decades old. So again, this has been going on for a while, and maybe is reaching a new realm of acceptance where I wonder how many people out there reading notice anymore. If a book doesn't have it, are you able to get into the flow of it, or do you go, whoa, I don't know when this character's speaking or not, or is it just so well done that you go with it and don't even recognize that you've been lulled into this maybe a little bit more intimately if the author's goals have been reached.
I would maybe put myself in the latter camp. I don't remember ever consciously noticing it before, and I think what made me start to notice it was when I came on to BookTube started my channel and noticed not lots, but some other booktubers complaining about it. Or maybe not just on BookTube, maybe on Goodreads and some of the Goodreads reviews, but people were quite vociferously complaining about the absence of quotation marks. And I thought, huh. And so then I started to pay attention to it. And I now, being just a little bit of a contrarian, I like to, as often as I can, make the pronouncement that I actually prefer my fiction not to have quotation marks. But the truth is that anything's okay, but I do find that I would agree. I'm not sure if I would agree with Cormac McCarthy that we don't need any punctuation. I'm not sure about that. And I could show you a whole bunch of texts on my phone for evidence. I think we maybe do need some. But for me as a reader, I find quotation marks are kind of juvenile.
That's interesting. And I wonder how much of it is the intention of the author. Are they being thoughtful about this, or are they aspiring to maybe something they've seen but don't know how to pull off yet? It talks about Lauren Groff, and I think she is brilliant and very thoughtful in what she
Yes.
has to say about her work, let alone her work itself. I mean, I think it's just amazing. And she said something about how she doesn't like quotation marks. It makes her feel like the character is always standing up at a podium. And I thought I'd never thought about it that way before. But I really love the books where the authors are consciously trying to say, hey, look, this whole thing is in someone's mind, not my mind, the character's mind. And I'm trying to show that this is how they're experiencing the world. And we don't really necessarily know where a sentence, something spoken out loud begins, where a thought ends. And I don't like to dictate that. I find those are done so well. Others, sometimes I'm sure there are plenty who do it poorly. And I finished a book this last week, Sean. It's called The Sunlit Man by Brandon Sanderson. It's
Oh,
fun science fiction fantasy. I think he's a really good writer, but I don't think I don't think the no quotations would work so well because it's and I don't want to say it's juvenile, but there is something about it's he's pushing a story forward, and sometimes those little markers can really be like handholds for the reader just to move across the pages without stopping and pondering too much. It's like the slow ascent of a hill, and where you don't have any handholds, versus something that's really someone's just putting them there so you can really just nothing in the text is hampering you. And yet at the same time, a lot of these authors talk about how quotation marks can, be a block in the flow of a story. I just find the whole thing, it probably goes a little bit both way depending on the skill of the author. I thought it was really fun to think about.
I know that a couple times in my reading over the past few years, I have thought, oh, you know what? This isn't done well because I don't really know which character's speaking,
Mm-hmm.
or I think I often appreciate being in that blurry zone where I don't know whether this is being said out loud or not. But if I don't know who's speaking and there's several people in the scene, or at least more than one person in the scene, I don't like that. And I think that's where I would draw the line. Like, I need to know who's speaking.
Again, unless the author has a very good reason for that, and they're pulling it off in other ways to make you to make you understand that becomes not as important as what the author is saying, then I think it could work. But yeah, otherwise it can be very, very frustrating. I mean, these things were put in for clarity's sake. That's why quotation marks there to begin with. It's to demarcate something for the reader, to help communication. But if the author's got something better to communicate and the absence is the way to do it, then I say go for it if you can do it. But again, we know there are some who are just going to do it because it might be trendy now. Oh, I'm going to write without quotation marks because that's when I'm writing serious literature versus, something else.
Now, Trevor, were you involved? I'm pretty sure Paul was, but I can't remember whether you were involved in a read along of the Dorothy Richardson. How many volumes is a series of novels?
Yeah, pilgrimage. No, I wasn't involved in that. I don't have any of those. And when I looked at it, they were hard to get, but I also saw the page count and thought, oh, I don't know if I'm up for that right now. So I
It's
didn't do
very
that.
tempting, but also very intimidating. Apparently,
Hmm.
she didn't use quotation marks, and that was fairly early in the 20th century. I can't remember exactly when,
Yeah,
but what, maybe
basically 100.
1930s?
Yeah, basically 100 years ago.
And then later she regretted it. And she
Oh, I
said, I
didn't see
was too
that.
hard. Well, I think I saw that in another article. I did a little bit of, pulling up some
Uh-huh.
other stuff. And she said, I was too hard on the reader. I feel like I should apologize to my readers that it made it too difficult to follow. So
Hmm.
I haven't read any of it. That's why I was curious to ask you if you had.
Well, no, not that one. But it does bring up what the modernists were trying to do. And I did when I got a master's degree, and my specialty was modern British literature with Woolf and Joyce, in large part because I loved grappling with what they were doing. But there was a deliberate effort on Virginia Woolf's part to kind of pull off the scaffolding that people would use to get around a piece of work, and so quotation marks and such. So it can have a bad reputation of deliberate obfuscation, that we're
Yeah.
doing this to make it hard. We don't want this to be easy on you, which maybe has its place, But if that's the only point, and if I do the work and it turns out you didn't have anything great to say by making it hard, it's just that's just a lousy book, at the end of the day. So
And we
there
all
are imitators, and maybe some who would say, the obfuscation was important as an exercise or even for my work. But I'm interested that Dorothy Richardson said I shouldn't have done it. I would do it different now. It's interesting.
and more recently, and this was in an article on the Penguin .co.uk website. I'll put a link in the show notes about the same topic. And apparently, Deborah Levy wanted to discard speech marks in her quite recent novel, The Man Who Saw Everything. I think it might be her most recent still. She said, because, and this is a quote from her, most of the contemporary writers I admired had skillfully ditched them, and I knew this was the way to go. But ultimately, she did decide to keep them in because, and this is also a quote, things were wild enough. In her book, they would have to be, she concluded, and I love this phrase, the Victorian swimsuit in my modernist novel.
I think that's so great. And what a
Comment,
way to look at it. Yeah.
I like that. I'll probably edit this out because I don't need to be so bitchy. But I like that comment far better than I like that novel that she's referring to.
I don't think you should edit that out. I think it's fair. Sometimes someone just has the best way of putting something. But I love how she puts it that way. And I think that's how quotation marks are seen. There is an element of tradition and of hierarchy and of privilege that many of these authors are deliberately trying to eschew. It isn't just to experiment. There's a throwing off the fetters as well, and I like how she puts it: a modernist novel, but that's the Victorians, the Victorian swimsuit.
Yeah,
It really puts it well.
it does. I talked about this with Trevor just before we pressed record, but I'm going to spring an excerpt from one of the novels referred to in this article on Trevor. It's from the very first page. It's not the actual opening. There's a couple numbered sections. I think they're numbered sections that are just one line each that aren't relevant. But then the full scene that's a paragraph or about half a page long. I'd like to show it to Trevor, and there's no quotation marks, and we can do a little experiment here.
I'm ready.
It's Ian Williams, his novel Reproduction, which won, I can't remember if it was the Giller or the Governor General's Award a few years ago. There it is. So here's what I'm not showing you because it's just, but this is at the very opening of the novel, and this section 2. Trevor, I will read it, but I don't know. I don't want to read it if it's going to interfere with you taking the text in. I can read it later, but just so there's not dead air.
I'm good with you going ahead and reading it.
Okay.
I'll read along with you.
Before she died, her mother was prickly. Before her mother died, she was, one more time, before her mother died, her mother was prickly. One more time. Before her mother died, her mother, prickled her, Felicia. In the days before she died, her mother flew into unpredictable rages over the littlest things. Felicia said sardines instead of tuna when passing the tin, and her mother blasted her. Why are you working yourself up so? Felicia asked. Because a tuna is a big fish and a sardines is a small fish. A sardines! You hear the nonsense you have me saying? Her hands vibrated so badly she couldn't open the tin. At the next meal, Felicia didn't pour tomato sauce quickly enough into a pot, a saucepan, thereby essentially, judging from her mother's reaction, assassinating the Archduke. All the nutrients gone already, her mother said. We might as well eat hare. You happy with yourself? So there. When you're ready, hold forth.
So I've not read this book before.
Neither have I. Yeah.
But I'm very intrigued. I love, even before we get to the first little part where there's clearly no quotation marks where often there would be in the past, or traditionally, we have this grappling with how to put things, how to think of things, how to say something. The first thing that you read is before she died, her mother was prickly. and then a reiteration, a recalibration of the words one more time. Let's do it again. And then even just the repetition of words like the pot, a saucepan, trying to get something clearer. The tin, the can, the tin. Is that meaning that the original was better? So this is kind of what we were talking about earlier of someone who's deliberately blurring lines, and we're in someone's head here more than we're watching an actual scene play out. And it really does, to me, mimic thought, the way things will just come and go and push and pull, that I can never say if I'm thinking of what someone said or of how it made me feel. I might not be thinking of the words so much as the impression. And this, to me, is a successful passage where the quotation marks would have changed that. They would have added a bit of solidity or something tangible to what is otherwise much more of an impression or a stream. And I don't necessarily mean the old stream of consciousness kind of thing. I mean, this to me is doing something even, it's maybe similar, but this is someone actually grappling with their consciousness, with what they're feeling versus what's just passing along through their senses. I love that.
Yeah, great. That's fabulous. Now, the first paragraph, was the only part of it where I stopped and consciously thought, now, is some of this being said out loud? Is there somebody speaking to our protagonist with the lines one more time? And I think ultimately I concluded, no, she's talking to herself, but there is an ambiguity there that for me enriched my reading of that paragraph.
Yeah. Enriching. That is a great way of putting that this can enrich a text. It can add to it. The subtraction can.
Right. All the other dialogue, I think it was very clear that who was speaking, and the fact that it was being spoken out loud or in the protagonist's memory. But I thought that first paragraph was really rich because it did make me stop and puzzle that out and return to it after I'd finished reading the rest of the scene.
Yeah. That's really lovely. And you're right. It isn't something. If I had read this without this absence of quotation marks in mind, I would have noticed the different ways of saying words, or kind of the effort to put something precisely or at least differently. I'm not sure I would have noticed the absence of quotation marks. It flows so nicely. I genuinely don't know if I would have been. I don't think I would have been confused, and I don't think it would have jumped out as something that the author had done for me. It just would have been me with the text. It would have worked. I think. I mean, who knows? Because I did encounter this under this, but I did recently read Lauren Groff's The Vaster Wilds, and I didn't know until I read that article that she had eschewed quotation marks for years. I've read lots of her work, and I wouldn't be surprised to go back to it and see that there are quotation marks all over the place. Just like now, I wouldn't be surprised to see there are. It just wasn't ever something I noticed. But I love her work, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of that is that it's just put so nicely, it flows so well, and she's doing things that I'm not even aware of on a conscious level.
Well, that was a really fun little experiment. Thank you. I think you've done this up. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this topic before we close?
So just briefly, if you don't mind, it's not just quotation marks that can kind of throw readers for a loop, maybe the first time they're encountering an author who's going against what you learn in school. Here's the proper way to use a comma. Here's of course, this is a period, and you have this independent clause and this independent clause. How do you delineate between them all in some kind of like logical, hierarchical sentence structure kind of way? There are a lot of authors who use run-on sentences to the point where they may have a whole big book with no periods, no paragraph breaks. You buckle in at the first word and doesn't end until you put the book down. And we talked about this briefly with Damien Searles in our last episode of the podcast about Yoon Fosse's work. He just won the Nobel Prize, this Norwegian author. he does use periods in some of his books, but in some he doesn't. And when we were talking about it, I said, this is an author who it doesn't feel like a gimmick just to get me running, from word one to the end. It makes me feel like I'm there. Now, it could be that I'm starting to become more aware of that part of me. I'm more sensitive to it. And so it's working better. But one of his very short books, Morning and Evening, doesn't really have any periods in it. And I was saying, I think it works. It didn't just feel like it wasn't a pacing thing or you got to, go through it worked for me. It worked on how I read the text and how I saw the characters and how I saw what they were going through. And I'm really excited to have that be a part of my analysis or my thoughts as I'm looking at books better, through this lens of, did they use quotation marks or not? How did that work on me? I'm going to go back to Lauren Groff's books, this weekend, because I just want to know how. I think that's so fun and such a great way to you learn. It's nice to just experience this. And I know some people are against
consciously pay attention to it and then realize what it might be doing. This was a wonderful chat. Thank you so much, Trevor.
Thank you, Shawn. I appreciate it.